Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session Christ Plays in 10,000 Places, which is part of the Hopkins Waterton Environmental Symposium at Stonyhurst. I'm Dr. Rebekah Lamb, a lecturer in theology and the arts at the University of St. Andrews, and I'm joined today by two fellow Victorian scholars and Hopkins enthusiasts who also happen to be not only colleagues who I have the privilege of collaborating with, but cherished friends as well. Professor Michael D. Hurley from Trinity College, University of Cambridge, who is also one of the trustees and directors of the Christian Heritage Center, and Professor Stephen Tardif from St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto are joining me today as we think through some aspects of Gerard Manley Hopkins' poetry, and especially as it relates to the themes of your symposium. As I was thinking about the theme for this symposium, I wanted to return to a small note that Gerard Manley Hopkins made shortly before his death, where he said, "My life is determined by the incarnation, down to most of the details of the day." For Hopkins, especially if we look at his poetry, from small flowers like bluebells to cloud patterns, from his pastoral duties to his contemplative life of prayer, Hopkins was always on the search for Christ and often said that he found him in all of the different varieties and multiplicities and beauties of nature, and also in some of the more difficult personal experiences that he had as a priest and poet. But he also found so much to enjoy and celebrate and praise in life as well. And he attributed this ability to give praise to the doctrine of the incarnation and the influence of Christ in his life. The incarnation is God becoming man, entering history and redeeming us from within history. Christ's incarnation proclaims that the world is good and not only restores our initial dignity, but elevates it, making us co-heirs of his kingdom. There are so many ways in which Gerard Manley Hopkins' deep appreciation for the personal relationship we can have with God that was made possible through Christ's incarnation, redemption, and resurrection is such an important part of his poetic vision. And in many ways, it resonates with the 2015 encyclical from Pope Francis called Laudato Si, which focuses on our call to care for our common home. In the next slide, you can see a quotation from Laudato Si, which I think really helps to set up some of the things we're going to think about and think through with Hopkins. And this is the quotation. "The creation accounts in the book of Genesis contain, in their own symbolic and narrative language, profound teachings about human existence and its historical reality. They suggest that human life is grounded in three fundamental and closely intertwined relationships: with God, with our neighbor, and with the earth itself. According to the Bible, these three vital relationships have been broken, both outwardly and within us. Together with our obligation to use the earth's good responsibility, we are called to recognize that other living beings have a value of their own in God's eyes. By their mere existence, they bless him and give him glory. And indeed, the Lord rejoices in all his works. By virtue of our unique dignity and our gift of intelligence, we are called to respect creation and its inherent laws. For the Lord by wisdom founded the earth." There are so many important phrases here and themes which emerge, some of them being the closely intertwined relationship that God has with the earth itself and also with us, and that we have close relationships, not only with each other within our human ecology, as Pope Benedict would say, but also with natural ecology, with all the relations between the animals and elements of nature. And that all of these things, nature, animals, human beings, are called by God to work with his plan, to respond to the love that he gives us, to be who we are made to be. And this is something that Hopkins thinks about a great deal in his poetry, and we can see in particular in his poem, "A Kingfisher's Catch Fire," which we're now going to discuss, and Professor Michael Hurley is going to introduce for us.
Thank you very much, Rebekah. So I think perhaps we should, or one of us, I will, read the poem to start with. It's one of Hopkins's most beautiful poems, but also his perhaps most metaphysically explicit. He has a kind of theology that's being inflected very carefully in subtle and sophisticated ways. But let's hear the poem itself to start with. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame, as tumbled over rim in roundy wells, stones ring. Like each tucked string tells, each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same. Deals out that being indoors, each one dwells, selves, goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. I say more. The just man justices, keeps grace that keeps all his goings graces, acts in God's eye what in God's eye he is. Christ. For Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. So as Rebekah has set us up very well to think about Hopkins's incarnational theology, I just want to parse out a little bit of what that might mean as we can see it playing through this poem and playing through Hopkins's writings more generally. What it doesn't mean is a secular appreciation of the beautiful in the world in all its individuation. It's not an objective aesthetic appreciation that's going on, but nor is it a deistic appreciation. That is to say, it's not the kind of appreciation that takes the form of acknowledging that God has created something beautiful in the world and that God is no longer, as it were, in the world. And what we're looking at is merely God's creation. It's something much more deeply implicated. The spiritual is implicated or interpenetrated with the material. John Cottenham, who's a contemporary theologian, says that he thinks that a lot of Protestant theology or practice gets very close to deism. He says they're very squeamish about miracles and they don't really sit well, a lot of Protestant thinking, with the idea that the world could be aflame or charged with the grandeur of God, as Hopkins puts it in another one of his famous poems. But that is absolutely what the stakes are for Hopkins, as Rebekah set us up to think. Hopkins becomes a Catholic, he tells several people, because of the Holy Eucharist. That is to say, the idea that the Holy Eucharist has the real presence of Christ within it, and he sees all creation in that way. Laudato Si in several places, but in paragraph 236 notes, it is in the Eucharist that all that has been created finds its greatest exaltation, and this is the Word made flesh. Now, there's a temptation or a danger, I think, when we think of the material world being shot through with the spiritual, to tip accidentally into pantheism. If deism is the danger of thinking that God is just stepping back from his creation and we're just admiring the objects of his creation, there's a corresponding danger of pantheism, which is to imagine that somehow nature itself is divine. Laudato Si again warns us against this. Paragraph 234, for example, says that the finite things of the world are not the really divine things in themselves. Think of another poet like Wordsworth. He has his great poem, The World is Too Much With Us, late and soon getting and spending, and it ends, I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn, so might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn. So this is a poet thinking, I'd rather be a pagan if I could just, the world could come alive, the natural world could come alive for me. Hopkins is very different from that. It's not that he thinks that the world is alive in the sense of it is itself divine, but rather that, as we'll come to in a later poem, speaks and spells, as is put here. And in a later poem, you can see another version of that, as it were, articulating God's presence. So we can think in this poem then that the visible created world speaks and spells of the invisible creator, but not in some passive way, in some way that is alive. We'll hear later, we'll be discussing Duns Scotus, who is a very important thinker, theologian, medieval theologian for Hopkins, who he first came across at Stonyhurst, in fact. Hopkins has very well developed ideas of the individuated material world. So the world is not a generic thing or a blurred thing, but each has an expression of an inscape, its singularity, what makes it sui generis. And Hopkins has this word in stress for the way we experience that world. And Duns Scotus helps him significantly along his way in thinking about what that might mean to see and to experience God in the world. Whilst Hopkins was at Stonyhurst, he also, of course, will have studied Thomas Aquinas, perhaps the greatest theologian within the Christian Catholic tradition. And again, in Laudato Si, there's a reference to Aquinas that Hopkins would have recognized. This is in paragraph 86. And Aquinas says, in his famous Summa Theologica, he says that variety comes from the intention of the first agent, and that God's goodness could not be represented fittingly by any one creature. So this variety of the created world, kingfishers doing one thing, dragonflies doing another thing, even a stone that tips down a roundy well. Aquinas says at one point that angels are greater beings than stones, but it's better to have stones and angels. And this is very much Hopkins's sense of the fecundity and the variety of the created world. Again, Laudato Si in 84 makes the point that although man is, as it were, at the head of creation, of the created world as we know it, made in the image and likeness of God, that is not to say that our relationship is one of pure of a master-slave dominion relationship, but rather one in which we're enjoined to see us as continuous with this created world, continuous with the love that infuses God's world. And so when we finally think about that last line, to farthering through the features of men's faces, or the one that sets it up just before that, which has been our title today, for Christ plays in 10,000 places, we're struck by a sense in which Hopkins is experiencing the world actively. It's not a passive or objective recognition of the world, but something he feels. And this brings us to a complex, difficult theological matter, but an extremely important one for Hopkins and for incarnational theology in general that Rebekah set us up to think about. That is to say, a Trinitarian logic. Now, again, Laudato Si, this is paragraph 208, says, we are always capable of going out of ourselves towards the other. And the important thing about this is what comes with coming out of yourself, something not just being about you, but somehow engaging with that beyond you, in this case, the created world. Pope Francis continues, unless we do this, come out of ourselves into the created world, other creatures will not be recognized for their true worth. This is what he calls a Trinitarian dynamism. So you have the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, the activity of these things. This is deep and complex theology. We're not going to get into it too much, but just to say that it implies an activity. So when we see the world as Hopkins sees it, we're seeing not just that God is in the world and recognizing that, but somehow there's an experience that brings us closer to God, and we are changed by that experience.
And if I could just pick up, Michael, on what you were just drawing from Pope Francis about coming out of ourselves, we can really see sort of the way that so many rich, dense theological and metaphysical ideas are sort of, finding their place in a poem, and the way that Hopkins is going to use the poetic form to really sort of like drill down and think about these things. Just going back to the first stanza that we see here, called an octave, as it contains 8 lines, we can sort of find actually sort of like a further split, the quatrains, the 4-line units. The first pyrotechnic beginning, that sort of like sonic singularity of expression that we just sort of like trip through so wonderfully, and as we did just now in your reading, we're sort of dazzled by the variety, the variegated nature of reality, but we actually come very quickly, to pick up again on the sort of like coming out of oneself, into a metaphysical vocabulary. You know what I mean? All the sort of, the richness of nature, all the sort of like the bells and the stones, they're all dimmed into a metaphysical lexicon that we don't actually notice, because it's sort of like drawn through by this metaphor of interiority becoming exterior, and then word and speech and indeed cry, sort of in that sort of elevated ascension right at the as we sort of like transition from the penultimate line to the last line, where the sort of like singularity itself starts to speak and spell, what I do is me, for that I came. So that's very much in the spirit, I think, of Michael, what you were just offering from Pope Francis, this sort of like Trinitarian procession, even in the order of creation, as Hawkins in the octave gives what could be called, I suppose, a general theory of specificity. And that's all sort of set up, however, in the octave, which in the sonnet form is usually the place, especially in the Petrarchan permutation, which Hawkins is using here, set up for the solution. There's a problem that's going to be articulated, and that problem goes back to, Michael, what you were just saying about the sort of way in which creation is completed by the delineation of various orders. We've been thinking about creation in a very general way, and now he wants to sort of, really drill down onto what moral beauty means. The just man, and he has this wonderful neologism, justices, right? He sort of, does the going and the doing of the first stanza, the octave, is now being sort of, used in a much clearer moral category. And that is going to be Hawkins' supplement to his account of creation. It's not just that there is sort of like, this wonderful beauty, it's that there are moral choices related to that beauty. And as he'll say and focus on in a sonnet later in his life, to what serves mortal beauty, picking up the Jesuit motto of, all things to the greater glory of God, but thinking through what will serve that moral beauty in a clearer way. He's already sort of like on the track of that in this poem, in this sestet, which he uses again to complete that vision, and sticks the landing, you might say, with that Trinitarian vision as Christ. And he risks that verbal repetition in the antepenultimate line in a very sort of like canny and knowing and dazzling way. But if I could just, shift our attention then to another poem, not to what serves mortal beauty, but an even third great meditation on the role of beauty and its relation to the natural world. We have, and my colleague Rebekah is going to read this poem soon, but let me just set this up by saying this is going to be a poem that, many readers of Hawkins just celebrate. It's been the favorite of many actors, in fact, to read. It's the final chorus to an incompleted tragedy. Hopkins had aspirations to complete many projects that remained unfinished. Scholarly, this one was dramatic, and it has to do with a saint's life, a virgin martyr. The legend is sort of like recorded in the 12th century, but it has deeper roots, and Hopkins was, always trying to connect to the autochthonous faith of the English peoples. This is another example of that, and it has to do with the myth of Saint Winifred, who, after being pursued by a man who was had an eye towards her virtue, was murdered and then restored to life in a miraculous way by the patron of the place in Wales, St. Bino, where he would study. And this is going to be the sort of like concluding choral culmination of this incompleted tragedy. And it sort of stages in the same way that Michael was talking about before, those sort of like, rich, dense metaphysical ideas. And here we now see them instantiated in these allegorical figures that take up the choral antiphonal structure of this poem, with a second voice coming in quite dramatically, as we'll hear a little bit later on. But with that, maybe Rebekah, you could offer the first part of this poem to us.
Happy to. At one point I did have this memorized, but I am definitely going to rely on the text. Especially what I would suggest to those listening to try to listen to the very musical quality of the words and the ways in which Hopkins, I think, is almost unparalleled in the way that he's able to unite poetry to almost what seems like sheer musicality. And that is an important theme in this poem as well. And we'll return to the musical shortly. How to keep. Is there any? Is there none such, nowhere known, some bow or brooch or braid or brace, lace, latch or catch or key, to keep back beauty? Keep it. beauty, 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 from vanishing away? Oh, is there no frowning of these wrinkles, ranked wrinkles deep down? No waving off of these most mournful messengers, still messengers, sad and stealing messengers of gray? No, there's none, oh no, there's none. Nor can you long be what you now are, called fair. Do what you may do, what? Do what you may, and wisdom is early to despair. To be beginning, since no, nothing can be done to keep at bay age and age's evils, hoar hair, ruck and wrinkle, drooping, dying, death's worth, winding sheets, tombs and worms, and tumbling to decay. So be beginning to despair. Oh, there's none, no, 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 there's none. Be beginning to despair, 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 despair.
Spare. There is one, yes, I have one, hush there, only not within seeing of the sun, not within the singeing of the strong sun, tall suns tinging or treacherous, the tainting of earth's air. Somewhere, elsewhere, there is, well, where? One. Yes, I can tell such a key. I do know such a place where whatever's prized and passes of us, everything that's fresh and fast flying of us, seems to us sweet of us and swiftly away with, done away with, undone, undone, done with, soon done with, and yet dearly and dangerously sweet of us. The wimple water dimpled, not by morning matched face, the flower of beauty, fleece of beauty, too apt to fleet, never fleets more, fastened with the tenderest truth to its own best being and its loveliness of youth. It is an everlastingness of, oh, it is an all youth. Come then, your ways and airs and looks, locks, maiden gear gallantry and gaiety and grace, winning ways, airs innocent, maiden manners, sweet looks, loose locks, long locks, love locks, gay gear, going gallant, girl grace. Resign them, sign them, seal them, send them, motion them with breath, and with sighs soaring, soaring sighs, deliver them. Beauty in the ghost, deliver it, early now, long before death, give beauty back. Beauty, 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 back to God, beauty's self and beauty's giver. See, not a hair is, not an eyelash, not the least lash lost. Every hair is, hair of the head numbered. Nay, what we had light-handedly left in surly, the mere mold will have waked and have waxed and have walked with the wind while we slept, this side, that side, hurling a heavy-headed hundredfold while we slumbered. Oh, then, weary then, why should we tread? Why are we so haggard at the heart, so care-coiled, care-killed, so fagged, so fashed, so cogged, so cumbered, when the thing we freely forfeit is kept with fonder care? Fonder care kept, and we could have kept it, kept far with fonder care, and we should have lost it, finer, fonder care kept. Where kept? Do but tell us where kept, where? Yonder. What high is that? We follow, now we follow yonder. Yes, yonder, yonder, yonder.
That was beautifully read, Stephen. It's quite a challenging piece to read out loud, but as you can see, and especially with Hopkins' poetry, as with any poetry, but it's certainly true for Hopkins, you really don't get the sense unless you read it out loud and you understand its musicality. And he really understood that the power of poetry was in its music and in its singing. And you can see that he so carefully matches form with feeling in this text. So if we return to the slide that starts off the poem with the leaden echo, we can hear that there is a slow and heavy burdened pace. And then things start to fly, as you can see from Stephen's beautiful reading, when the golden echo comes and a sense of hope starts to emerge in the poem. And the hope widens out into an expression of the Christ promise to come again, and that everything that we have loved and treasured but cannot hold to in this fading world will be cared for and kept and held precious and redeemed when we finally come to union with Christ, the other side of the veil. And one of the dramatic tensions at the beginning of the poem in the leaden echo is this question of how to hold on to, how to keep the things that are beautiful, and particularly the question of how do we hold on to beauty itself? And this, of course, is a perennial question. So many artists and philosophers and theologians have pondered the nature of beauty over the history of human thought. And one of the things that was very poignant in the Romantic period was this fascination with the beauty, to the point where it very easily could become a replacement theology. And this certainly occurred in the Victorian period as well, with the emergence of the aesthetes and the decadent movement, and this promotion of art for art's sake. While it certainly emphasized the value of the objective beauty of the objective goodness of beauty in many senses, beauty can also be what Hopkins would often call dangerous if, instead of thinking about God, we dwell instead on the marvels and beauties of the creative world, but don't also think about the great creator who made all of these things and whom the world reflects. And so in the first part of the poem, The Leaden Echo, what we see is Hopkins really taking this love for beauty, earthly beauty, to its radical conclusions, and showing that death is how we will lose everything that we love, and even beauty, we will lose it through death. And so there is nothing within the human condition that is going to enable us to somehow preserve this beauty on our own accord. And if we're only left with this beauty and nothing beyond it, then one of the consequences most likely is despair. And I'd like to just think about that word despair for a moment, because Hopkins was someone he was a man who was well acquainted with grief and with suffering, and especially in certain parts of his life, really struggled with a dark night of the soul, and I think very possibly also depression. And he very admirably persevered through various periods that were very hard for him. And these are especially expressed in spiritual terms in his poems, which are often called the Terrible Sonnets, or the Dark Night of the Soul Sonnets, where he stages different kinds of wrestlings with God, as he puts it, but also is very honest and takes no prisoners, and revealing the degree to which he understood what it was like to come close to despair. But one of the things that's so striking in those poems is that we see when the speaker of these poems is closest to feeling completely undone, that's where, paradoxically, Christ is closest to him, because of course in our incarnation, Christ embraced the whole spectrum, the whole range of human experiences, and not just joy and wonder and delight and friendship, but also sorrow, and even feeling abandoned on the cross by all who loved him. And he even cries out, "God, why have you forsaken me?" So Christ entered into the world to take on all that is human, and to redeem it, and to give us hope for new life and resurrection. And so you see the ways in which, at one level, this poem is doing so many things. We could talk about it for hours, but Hopkins is showing the degree to which, even in despair, if one can have the courage to turn to hope, and not hope in earthly things, but theological hope, hope in Christ, then even in despair, hope can be found. And that's why that remarkable, unexpected shift occurs in the poem, where even in the echo of despair that seems to be dragging us down, even as you say it out loud, the word out loud, and you have to repeat it so many times, the light word spare comes out of it. And then this whole shift towards hope. So now I'll give it over to you, Stephen, in case you'd like to talk about.
Stephen, before you riff on this, may I just quickly say that that's beautifully said, Rebekah. And in the poem that we were looking at just before, that key line of which we've taken as our motif for our chat today, Christ plays in 10,000 places. It is very important, I think, to think that these poems that Hopkins are writing are not academic exercises. I was very conscious as I was parsing out theologically what was going on, and we could have spent a lot more time on it, that somehow it could feel like a clever bit of writing and so on. I mean, I shared with you, Rebekah, and Stephen, before we jumped on the Zoom, at lunch today, I was talking to someone who told me that they knew someone who said that Hopkins had saved their life, in the sense that they had served in the Great War, and Hopkins's poems, which find Christ in 10,000 places, including in the depths of despair, not just in beautiful kingfishers and dragonflies, which we think of as kind of prototypically beautiful and elevating and so on, but absolutely at the heart of despair too. And it's his range, I think, which is astonishing and uplifting. So I just want to do, as we're tipping from Rebekah's account of the leaden echo to Stephen as he took us to the golden, it seems that pivot point is absolutely essential to keep in mind with Hopkins, that we're not dealing with an intellect who is somehow euphorically reveling in God's beauty all the time, but knows whereof he speaks at the depths of despair. Oh, the mind has mountained, hold them cheap they who ne'er hung there, he says in one sonnet.
I think that's such a salutary reminder, Michael, and really, to connect what you've just shared with what Rebekah had given us previously. One can say that yes, at the moment of desolation, Christ is most present, but it is only found at the bottom. It is only sort of like Hopkins' faith is a function of Hopkins's honesty, one could say, and it's precisely by looking things and seeing things so clearly. We've seen it in a different context where Hopkins is celebrating nature, but he sort of like needs to say more, right? There's a way in which Hopkins in this poem, which has the form of not only sort of like the refurbishment of an echo, he's obviously thinking about Ovid and the myth of Narcissus, but also sort of like the transmutation, right? The alchemical miracle that turns lead into gold. You only get the golden moment from the sort of giving the leaden echo the full voice, and command of the stage, because who would argue with the leaden echo on points? Who would argue as the years tick by and the mirror becomes a less enjoyable place to visit and discover every day? There's a way in which he's sort of like really being very honest, and it's precisely in that honesty and out of that honesty that so much of the metaphysical positions that are not unsatisfying are going to be reached here. And I think that especially in the leaden echo, where you sort of like feel the way in which beauty can be an occasion to discover a bitter broken promise, because this all fades away and it's all taken from you. And what emerges in the second half of the poem, the response, the riposte, you could say, again, this is a tragedy focusing on a virgin martyr who gives up her life and gives it up freely. The way in which, it's actually an ethics of orientation, right? It's actually sort of like the way in which, not in the sort of like rapacious, grasping, clutching, clenching way in which you want to hold on to beauty, above all else, as it sort of like slips through your fingers even more in that moment. It's really about giving back. It's really about that sort of like appropriate orientation. And I think that, there's much more to say, and we can connect it to, contemporary phenomenology and sort of like advanced work that's being done in that area. I think though, to your point, Michael, about these being sort of, not academic exercise and connected to real life, I think we could take, especially in the context of the symposium, that ethics of orientation, and see a way in which to sort of like find a thread that would get us back to indeed Laudato Si, and some of the Holy Father's reflections on the nature of the created world. And maybe that, Rebekah, is a thing to which we could turn now.
Thanks so much for that, Stephen. That's a really great way to segue. One other thing that I would love to note about the poem that we've just been discussing is the way in which, towards the close, there's not just levity and an increasing joy and a musicality, but then also a certain tenderness in the way that Hopkins reminds us that God cares for all of our cares, and he can actually care about our concerns better than we can and take good care of them. And so one of the things that's been striking me lately as I revisit Hopkins, which is something I do almost on the daily, as I think a lot about his place as priest as well, and especially the way in which he as a Jesuit has been trained to so carefully think about and meditate on how all the different aspects of our daily life, our joys, our hopes, but also our fears and anxieties can be brought to Christ and laid at his feet, and we can talk to him about them, and we can turn to scripture and see in scripture Christ offering us a very tender way of caring for all of the things that concern us. And this indeed is something that so often comes up not only in the writings of St. Ignatius of Loyola, but also in the Divine Office, where all the different cares of the day are brought into the very structure and rhythms of the liturgy of the hours. And there are a series of petitionary prayers that are present, especially, for instance, in lauds in the morning, which helps to bring a deep sense of the deeply personal reality of our relationship with God in the Christian faith. And this relationality is something that I think Christianity can really uniquely offer to the current discourses on our relationship to nature and to even just human networks and ecologies as well. And it's really encapsulated very beautifully in paragraph 76, which I'm just going to read to you. I will leave paragraph 77 unread, but I encourage some of you who might be interested in Laudato Si to revisit these slides, and perhaps also to check out Laudato Si, which you can find open access as well. And so here we see this passage reminding us that nature is something which is a gift, and that the Father, God the Father, has gifted us to each other, and the world has gifted the world to us and we are to steward it. So paragraph 76 reads, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the word creation has a broader meaning than nature, for it has to do with God's loving plan, in which every creature has its own value and significance. Nature is usually seen as a system which can be studied, understood, and controlled, whereas creation can only be understood as a gift from the outstretched hand of the Father of all, and as a reality illuminated by the love which calls us together into universal communion. And with that, I think we shift very nicely into the final discussion we're going to have, which focuses on Hopkins' poem, Pied Beauty. And I'll turn it over to Michael now.
Thank you, Rebekah. So Pied Beauty is probably the easiest immediately to understand. The discussion of his Kingfisher's Catchfire, I'm aware that I'll take responsibility for this, short-circuited to some of the deep theology, getting towards Trinitarian movements and so on. But I'm aware that even just understanding that poem, what does his Kingfisher's Catchfire even mean in a single sentence? I think one might say, well, what it means is, when a cow is munching its grass and properly being a cow, then somehow this is being adequate to God, and by extension, when a frog is jumping around and being a proper frog, it's being adequate to creation. And so how much more, or what does it mean for human beings to be adequate to God's plan for us, to speak and spell our name properly and so on? And I think it's a complex poem. That this is less complex, but as with Hopkins often, though less complex, not less deep. And we're going to give Hopkins the last words. We're going to read the poem last. So unlike the other two poems, I'm just going to front load with a few things about this poem to try to draw out a bit of the depth, which is not as complex immediately to understand what is, as it were, saying, to paraphrase it. But I think it's nonetheless worthy of our attention in the other ways that we've been looking at, partly because it's beautiful, it's crafted in a gorgeous way, but also because it's deep in that theological sense, not merely philosophical. It's not just deep ideas in an abstract sense, but it's connecting with the deep things that we understand at the heart of the Catholic religion. So this is a sort of sonnet. Hopkins called it a curtle sonnet, so it's like a shrunk sonnet, 10.5 lines. And it's a sort of sonnet because it's not just a small version of a sonnet, it keeps the proportions of the sonnet. So Stephen was talking about how the octave shifts to the sestet in the first poem. We know how there's a volta that you'll be familiar with in the sonnet tradition. This has one too, but it's shrunk. I really want to just say two things by way of setup. One is around the poem's celebration of variegation. We've seen this already as Kingfishers Catch Fire. Kingfishers do this, dragonflies do that, and even stones do their own thing and so on. Here we have a further elaboration and efflorescence of that logic. We get a diversity or variegation of color and speed and tastiness and luminosity and so on, and wonderfully glossed in that counter-original, spare, strange that we'll get to. It's the beginning of the second part of the poem, all things counter-original, spare, strange. And there are different ways of thinking about this variety that he's valorizing. Why is it that pied beauty, piedness, is to be valorized? Because we can understand valorizing a kingfisher, which is so beautiful, or a dragonfly and so on. But the kinds of things he turns his attention to are far more modest. One of the things to say is, within the context in which this poem is written, 1877, there are many writers and thinkers very troubled by what they see as a kind of flattening out and a washing out of the world. Dickens is endlessly talking about the kind of grey cities and so on. But you also get people like J.S. Mill talking about the kind of homogenization of the world and so on, the mechanization of the world. And Hopkins is celebrating the opposite of that. He's very much in their spirit, one might say sociologically. Aesthetically, he's very much in the spirit of someone like Ruskin, who he much admired. Ruskin, the great art critic, cultural critic, whose skyscapes and landscapes and other kinds of scaping, as Hopkins would imagine it, manages to get out the singularity of things, not just the generic thing, but what's peculiar and unusual and individual about things. He's very much in that line. Philosophically, we might see Hopkins's poem as aligning with Aristotle's sense that all change and difference presupposes something unchangeable. This is the idea of the kind of unmoved mover within a theological tradition. And certainly as we tip from philosophy into thinking about theology, we have here in Hopkins's sense the infinite generativity of God. That is to say that the sheer variety of things speaks of God's capacity to create itself. And this is something that Augustine talks about in the Confessions and so on. I just wanted to read you a single sentence from another Jesuit. This is from the 16th century, a cardinal later made a saint and a doctor of the church. This is Robert Bellarmine, and he writes on a treatise called The Mind's Ascent to God Through the Ladder of Created Things. And he says simply, though the mere multitude of created things is itself wonderful, still more wonderful is the variety which appears in that multiplication, and this is the rider, it leads to us more easily to the knowledge of God. So there's something about this variegation which I think is very much Hopkins feels the same. He's amazed at the sheer fecundity of creation. And that first poem had that wonderful line about fathering forth. And here, certainly in the slide that Rebekah said that we could all read on our own time, which was paragraph 77, quotes the Psalms in that paragraph from Laudato Si 77, Psalms 33:6. By the word of the Lord, the heavens were made. And so it's this sense of the purposiveness. It's not just that somehow there's been a big bang and we have all this extraordinary creation, but it has a purpose. And that's the trajectory of the poem, which brings me to the second thing I wanted to say, which I'll say very briefly, which you can just see in those last two words: praise him. So it's not just looking at the world and thinking, gosh, what an extraordinary, a dazzle of diversity. But what does this all amount to? It amounts to an injunction for us to engage doxologically. That's the theological term, the praise of God. That's what we're enjoined to do when we recognize that Christ is playing in 10,000 places, that we are called to prayer, and that prayer involves us recognizing the beauty, but also our responsibility in respect of that beauty. And the burden of Laudato Si is very much placed on that responsibility, that we are stewards and that we have a responsibility as part of creation created by God to a purpose. And certainly that paragraph 72 of Laudato Si, quotes one of the many Psalms exhorting us to praise God the Creator. And one of the prompts and cues and stimuli for this is an adequate attunement or orientation, as Stephen was saying, towards the beauty of the world, and not just as the Romantics understood it, the great waterfall or the Grand Canyon or the wonderful sunset, but everything, weeds and cows of couple color, and so on. So before I read the poem, I just wanted to hand over to Rebekah and Stephen if there's any loose ends that they wanted to pick up of things that might have been said, should have been said, or either about this poem or more broadly.
Well, I know we're all just raring to hear the poem being read, but I'll just very quickly walk backwards from the end, that doxological conclusion that you pointed our attention towards, and just sort of like connect it to what has been said, I think, before about the way in which Hopkins gets there, right? Hopkins is taking a risk here, and you can sort of like see the risk increase as the poem proceeds. We start with pied, two-partness, but also sort of like something a little bit hidden, dappled again, sort of like that variegation that you and Robert Bellarmine were drawing our attention to, and he really amplifies it with fickle freckled, macula would be the word in Latin that would translate. So he's sort of like saying, not only for the things that are unlike God in various ways, but sort of like even this glancing blow perhaps at sin itself. Rebekah, you had sort of like brought up in other contexts, like the Felix culpa tradition, right? This is, again, I think, an example of Hopkins's own honesty and his fidelity to his own experience. And he sort of like breaks through to the other side of this by saying, even as we sort of like comprehend all of the sort of like variety and variegated nature of creation, right, we can sort of like actually get to a point by going further and going deep enough down into creation. Again, we're echoing the language of God's grandeur. We find the thing that enables us to really render God's praise. So it's kind of a very dazzling high wire act in a way, that how can we get from pied beauty, not an ode to intellectual beauty, not anything else but what's in the created world, the froggy frogs, the munching cows. How do we sort of like in fact sort of like bundle this all together in a way that sort of like gives access? And he's really looking for a way, I think, in fact, to sort of relate those two things. We've already mentioned the Trinitarian logic of as kingfishers catch fire, and there's a similar sort of like loaded word. We've seen it again in Pope Francis, sort of like saying that this is a gift from the Father to all, and so I think that sort of metaphysical and Trinitarian dimension is really what allows Hopkins to sort of, own the experience that he articulates in this poem.
I think what you're both so beautifully pointing out in different ways is the way in which Hopkins is so carefully tuned into creation. And one of the things he's doing here, there's so much to say about the poem, but one of the things he's doing is also inviting us to look at the commonplace, the hidden, the very ordinary. Again, rethink cows, right? Or the fickle and freckles that you normally wouldn't see, a romantic Keatsian sonnet to a fickle freckled anything, right? So there's something incredibly beautiful about the way in which he's reminding us of the great dignity and value of the ordinary. And after his time in Liverpool and Glasgow in particular, where he was seeing how, as Michael has reminded us, so much of industrialization was turning everything into kind of a foggy, indeterminate, gray atmosphere, Hopkins wants us to return to look at things with a deeper clarity. And through the incarnation, through Christ playing in 10,000 places, Hopkins says we see the great model for learning how to see, how to look at things, how to pay attention. And that's a huge part of stewarding and really taking up the challenge and the invitation that Pope Francis gives to us in Laudato Si. And the final thing I would just like to note here is his mention not only of the natural worlds, but also indirectly, he's also talking about human life and human activity as well, when he talks about all trades, their gear and tackle and trim. And here he's really emphasizing that even in the various ordinary jobs and tasks of various workers, they too can participate in praising the God who fathers forth all of creation. And through our ordinary work in perhaps our seemingly ordinary, even repetitive lives, we can actually find, if we know how to look and how to pay attention, the great splendor of God's beauty and also an invitation to participate in cultivating it. And in that way, through even our our work and our way of looking and seeing the world, we are then participating in the call, that doxological call to praise God. Um, I could keep going, but I'll
I
leave it.
think wonderful. We could all keep going, but I think we should we should give Hopkins the last word. But it is a wonderful segue you've offered there, Rebekah, because the dignity of work, certainly at a school like Stonyhurst, where wonderfully you're enjoined to write AMDG at the top of your work, for all your work, of some of which may be more scrappy or more polished than others. Hopkins is offering the dignity of that in the gear and tackle and trim. It's not just the high trades, but that this is part of praise too. And the final thing I'll say, Aidan Nichols, the wonderful, very prolific and brilliant Dominican theologian, says of this poem that it could almost have been written to illustrate the Jesuit motto of Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam, that really this is a poem of praise which precisely converges with AMDG. That seems like the right note on which to end, and over to Hopkins. Pied Beauty. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple colour as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire coal, chestnut falls, finches' wings, landscape plotted and pieced fold, fallow and plough, and all trades, their gear and tackle and trim. All things counter, original, spare, strange. Whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, dazzle, dim, he fathers forth, whose beauty is past change. Praise him.